Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night, what immortal handle I thy frame their fearful symmetry. Boom!
Hey there, poetry pals, welcome back to another video. This week I am talking about how poetry has been made optional on the English Literature GCSE paper next year. I planned on doing my video last week, back when this was the biggest educational story in the UK. But then my laptop died. Thank you to everyone who's donated me a coffee so I can afford a new one. And the Tory government screwed over an entire generation of students with their A-level algorithm. If you don't know what I'm talking about, give it a goog. And I mean, we could do an entire video talking about how this Tory government have screwed over the education system for many years, but it's always happened implicitly, and this time they did it explicitly with their weird A-level algorithm thing. I don't like getting too political on it, but let's just say fuck the Tories. Okay, sweet, let's carry on. Anyway, it did make this story a lot less relevant in educational news, but god damn it, I did the research, I asked my followers for their opinion, and I did an hour-long interview with my mum, so god damn it, we're doing this goddamn video. Before we do get started, please make sure you're subscribed to my channel. I make amazing videos about poetry and how to write poetry and other really cool fun stuff, so you should definitely subscribe and put notifications on. By the way, kind of big news, but I am on 500 subscribers. Ayo! Thank you to all the strangers who've subscribed, and not just my friends and family who I've bullied into it. I really appreciate it. And next week, to celebrate, I am doing a Q&A. So if you have any questions for me, put them in the comments section and I will answer them in next week's video. While we're on the subject, follow me on social media. I am Josie Alford Poet on all the things. Okay, I realise I'm becoming one of those YouTubers, so let's get on with the video. A couple of weeks ago, OFQUAL, the exam regulator, announced that it was making changes to the requirements for the English Literature GCSE paper, which included making poetry as one of the subjects being made optional. They also, in the same announcement, made changes to the history paper, but this YouTube channel is all about poetry, so we're just gonna focus on the lit paper. When the news broke, my social media feeds were full of angry poets decrying this decision, and also with headlines from the BBC saying why you should not give up on poetry, like that is what OFQUAL did. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about the facts of the case. I'm also going to be talking about the issues and problems with this decision, whilst also sharing the opinions of my followers as well as my mum, who I interviewed for this. She's an English teacher, by the way, so it is relevant. I didn't just, you know, interview my mum just for the sake of it, but she is awesome, so maybe I should do that more often. And then I'm gonna wrap up with some opinions of my own. Here are the facts. Number one, as a result of the pandemic, the students that are going into year 11 this September have missed 3 months of school time. By that I mean physical contact time, not just virtual learning, which of course did continue for a bit. Depending on how the pandemic develops, we might end up in a second lockdown within a year, which means these students might miss out on even more school in their GCSE year. Number two, OFQUAL, the exam regulator, did a survey asking people whether the exam requirements should be changed, and almost half of the respondents said yes. Number three, the decision was made to make a number of the topics optional so that schools and teachers can focus on a smaller number of texts. It's not just poetry, people. Number four, students will still have to write about a Shakespeare play, but only will have to write about 2 of the following 3 topics. One of those is poetry, the other one is a 19th century novel, and the other one is post-1914 British fiction or drama. Number 5, it's only for this year. It is the decision's been made as a direct result of the pandemic and its impact on this year of students. After this year is done, hopefully life and therefore schooling will have returned to some sort of normality, and so will the GCSE requirements. Now, there are a number of issues and criticisms to be had with this, so we're going to get into it. I decided to interview my mum, who is an English teacher. Now, we recorded this on Zoom and the quality isn't great, and sometimes you can't hear my mum, so I have provided subtitles. But it is worth noting that I ended up only using the few key clips and not the whole interview, which lasted almost an hour, just because it was a lot of editing to do.
Thank you for agreeing to being interviewed. Please, can you just say what your job is for context?
Okay, so I'm an English teacher at a secondary school. I teach years 7, 8, 9, 10 and 11. Can I just say where I came from? Or to get
sure. Yeah,
so I've been in education for the last 19 years, where I've been a teaching assistant, higher level teaching assistant, and then went on to become a teacher. So I'm still within my first 5 years of teaching, but love it.
So what are your initial thoughts when that news came out?
So, well, I've just actually got up the email that we've had through from OFQUAL that was saying about next year. And bearing in mind, it's just next year.
Yeah.
It's not going to be an ongoing thing.
So do you think that the change is a positive one for next year?
Definitely, because year 10 and 11, the GCSE course is a 2-year course for the language and the literature. What we study in 7, 8 and 9, yes, we do other Shakespeare, we do other texts, but there's nothing that we're going to study at GCSE level. So it is a 2-year course. And obviously we make the decision before we come to teach it, what we're going to be teaching when. And I mean, it used to be that the poetry at our school, we would just teach in year 11. But I mean, it's just ridiculous, the thought of these students having to learn 15 poems. So that's why this year we decided before the pandemic, they would learn 5 before the summer holidays. And then into year 11, we'd do 2 chunks of 5 poems. So whether we carry on or not, I don't know.
So here's a thing that I didn't realise until I was researching it. When you say they have to learn 15 poems, don't they have to learn it off by heart, the poems?
Well, okay, so I think years ago when I was at school, when we studied anything, we learnt it off by heart. Shakespeare, whatever, it was learned off by heart. When I say you've got to learn it, you have to have an understanding of the poem. You need to know the context. You need to know what was going on at the time that the poet decided to write the poem, what was going on in their lives, and that, has a really important, I can't think of the word.
Context.
Yes, on how they've written the poems. So it's really important. I would say all 15 poems, you have to know what they're about. If you don't understand that, there's just no point. So you have to have a deep meaning, understanding what the poem's about. But I would say you probably need to learn about 4 or 5 quotes from the poems, bearing in mind we do the power and conflict. So I would always suggest to my students that the quotes they learn for each poem
are relevant to those themes.
Yes, without the power and conflict,
So the reason I ask is because it's not an open book exam, so you don't get copies of the poems in the exam.
No.
That's crazy to me.
It is. So what the students get now, they have 1 poem from the power and conflict typed out in front of them.
Right.
And then next to it, they have a list of the other 14 poems. And then there will be a question. And the question could be to do with anything to do with power of nature, power of humans, conflict as in wars.
And I guess you have to compare and contrast with the one that's printed there, and then you pick one of, because we didn't have to do that when I was at GCSE. And
no, you didn't.
One of the things that another teacher, Chrissy, lovely Chrissy, she suggested that actually, making the poetry optional, yes, it does make it easier, but actually what would have made it a whole lot easier is letting it be an open book exam, for people who are watching who don't know what an open book exam is, it means you get clean copies of the poems in front of you. So you don't have to memorise quotes, because the point Chrissy made is that it just becomes a memory exercise rather than an understanding exercise. What do you think about that?
I think it's a good idea, especially for students who struggle with poetry. I mean, and obviously I've had school teaching poetry as well, which has been really beneficial. But I think a lot of the time you mention the word poetry and boom, shutters it down. Kids don't want to know. So it's making poetry fun. And I think some kids get it straight away, because what I love about poetry, there is no right, there is no wrong answer. It's what you feel. And I think that gives way to the students. It's like, okay, well, if I think this and I can prove it with some pieces of evidence, then that's good. I might not agree with someone else, but that's showing what I think about. And actually, I think a personal response is really, really important, because it means the students are thinking about it. But for those who struggle, having a poem in front of them so they can find the quote is so much easier.
So here are the issues surrounding this subject. Number one, at least in the world that I live in on the internet, which is full of poets and poetry lovers, I think that this may have been a clickbaity overreaction. Now, I am going to go on to say what is wrong with the decision, so hear me out. I think a lot of poets were quick to judge and condemn this decision, especially because they sit on the side of poetry. I think this was exacerbated by headlines that made it seem a lot worse than it actually is. But hey, even the BBC need those sweet, sweet clicks, so I get it. I think one of the key things that you would easily miss if you didn't actually read the articles is that it is only for a year, and it's not just poetry that's being made optional. I think it's really an interesting thing to bear in mind, but I do think that the way the exam itself is structured and the requirements for studying poetry, I have a feeling a lot of teachers and schools are going to choose to make not teach the poetry. We'll get into why in a bit. Another issue that I think is really related to this subject is the coronavirus pandemic and the impact that it has had on education. Both teachers and students had to adapt to teaching and learning virtually, which me and Mum fell foul to during the interview when our internet cut out.
Okay, so the internet cut out and I was like, bloody Mum in Devon with a crappy internet, and then I realised it was me.
I actually thought it was me, to be fair, because having Zooms with the English department all through this pandemic has been a nightmare. And I've spent my time, they've all been frozen for most of it, and I haven't had a word.
Okay, so that actually really, well demonstrates what my question was going to be. So how has virtual learning been for you when teaching your kids?
Really difficult. I mean, I've really struggled because obviously the age I am, I struggle with online things, and the kids that I teach must think it's hilarious that Miss Johns is setting everything online. I've really enjoyed it, and actually once I got into the way of it, it was easy. So we decided as a department we would each do scheme of work. So I did year 7, other people did other things. We put it in a central point, and then we rolled it out to the students. A lot of it was, obviously it was all online learning. The trouble we have is down here, it's quite, I don't want to say it's poor, but a lot of people might have one laptop between a family of 5. We've got some students who have no internet access, or the fact that internet, as we've just seen, goes down. I've had students messaging me going, oh my God, Miss, all I've got is my little iPhone with a crack down it, and that's all they have to do all their work on. I assumed, because I've got a laptop, James has got a laptop, I have a kitchen table I can sit at, a separate room, that everyone has that. And it wasn't until after speaking to parents, because I've spoken to all my kids I teach, I really wanted to speak to them, see how they're coping, not to have a go at them and say, you need to be working, but actually, how are you managing? And realising that some kids they don't have a table to sit at. They don't have a computer, or the poor old parents have got, yes, their child's in year 10 or 11, well, obviously not year 11, but they're trying to home school kids at primary.
Yeah.
Crazy. I honestly don't think I could have coped. So how can I reprimand people who are struggling when I know darn well I wouldn't have done it? I couldn't have done it.
So you think as a result of that, especially the kids who are in year 10 who will be doing their exam next year, that this change to the exams is a good thing?
I do, because out of my whole class, not even 50% were engaging.
Wow.
But the interesting thing is, since schools opened up to year 10s, once they were in with a proper teacher, the work was coming. But also the students were saying to me, we can ask you questions. If we don't get it, we can ask you. Whereas when you've got something written on a computer in front of you, if you don't get it, it's really hard. So we started doing, when we did our PowerPoint, especially for the poetry, is I would attach to my PowerPoint an audio, so they would hear me talking through it. I also started doing annotations through a visualizer, so I would have the piece of paper and they would see my hand annotating and me talking them through how to annotate. Because if they've never done that before, how we know how to annotate because we've done it for a long time. They wouldn't have a clue.
There are massive issues with learning virtually, and kids from poorer backgrounds are less likely to be able to engage with virtual learning because they have less access to technology. In the rural area that I grew up, the internet is rubbish, and so even that leads to a lot of issues. It means the gap between poorer students with bad internet and richer students with great internet and their own laptops is just going to grow even more, which, with the addition of this A-level fiasco, it's just super worrying. I can understand why they wanted to make the GCSE paper easier for students, because a lot of them, like Mum said, up to about half of her students have not been engaging in virtual learning, and that means that they're going to really struggle to do a whole exam with the same requirements as the year before. So I get why they're trying to make it easier. The third issue here is that those changes to the paper aren't enough. Duncan Baldwin, Deputy Director of Policy at the Association of School and College Leaders, said that the changes amount only to tinkering at the edges when it is clear that students could experience widespread, ongoing disruption over the course of the next academic year. I asked my mum what she thought about this.
So what I understand from them saying this is just the edges of the problem is, we were lucky enough that we were organised, that we'd done Jekyll and Hyde and Inspector Calls and Macbeth. So those were taught in year 10. If they hadn't, and we've been focusing on perhaps just language, imagine now we're going to go back in September. If we go back, hopefully everything will be fine, having to teach all those. But actually we're going to have a lot of kids who've done nothing since we since we shut down in March. And they're going to struggle to get back.
Now, another issue with this decision is it does show the education system's priorities. So Shakespeare is compulsory, but poetry isn't. And I think it shows a worrying priority that Shakespeare is more important than more contemporary poetry. I'm worried that this is the beginning of the end. And I think that it is based on the mistaken belief that people don't like poetry. Kate Clanchy, a poet, wrote an opinion piece for The Guardian, and she said that the science GCSE is not being cut. And it actually says a lot about the importance and the perceived importance of poetry. She also says that it is a mistake to believe that students aren't engaging with poetry, and that more and more students and teenagers are writing poetry and sharing it on Instagram and TikTok and stuff like that. That is her experience as running writing workshops for teenagers. So I think it is worrying and showing how out of touch the education system is. So someone on my Instagram account said, as an English teacher and someone who writes and performs poetry, I find it an issue. This move absolutely narrows the diversity of the literature curriculum with less female and BIPOC voices. I'd rather make Shakespeare optional, to be honest, as it's archaic and he's essentially a plagiarist. The range of quickfire poems helps some students engage with the subject too. I'm going to talk about diversity on the curriculum in a bit, but I think it is interesting what he says about Shakespeare, as it is archaic, but I also love the drama of Shakespeare being a plagiarist. I mean, as someone who studied Shakespeare in literally every level of education, the conspiracy theories around Shakespeare are my favourite. My favourite is that Shakespeare never actually existed and it's a conspiracy, and Shakespeare's actually made up of several writers of the time. Thoughts? Let me know. So the next issue is to do with diversity in the curriculum. When asked about this in an article, the Poetry Society said that it was important to recognise that poetry provides a lot of the diversity in the GCSE curriculum. When I read that, I decided to have a look, and sadly, it's true. I went and looked into a lot of the major examination boards and their reading list, and the fact remains is that poetry is one of the only places where you're going to get diverse voices. And if you're only teaching 2 out of those 3 topics, then there is a chance that you're going to only have old white men who they're studying. Around the time that the news broke, Anthony Anaxaguru tweeted, "An English teacher just sent me this. Someone should, if they haven't already, publish a book of testimonials from teachers around the country highlighting the power and utility of poetry when it's granted permission to move around and impact us in the way it wants." And the message says, exactly, "As an English teacher, I find today's news heartbreaking. There was a beautiful moment last year when I was teaching the Emigre to my GCSE class, and one of my students came to me at the end of the lesson to say how for the first time since he arrived in England he read something about him. My biggest worry is that students that need poetry the most will miss out." So one of the issues of this news story is that it exposes the issues with diversity on the curriculum, and maybe this is an opportunity to make that better going forward by the news story bringing it to the front. The next issue is another thing that it exposes, which is issues with the focus of the curriculum itself. Unfortunately, I lost the screenshots of this message, but one of my friends who is a teacher messaged me talking about the fact it is not an open book exam. An open book exam is when you have a copy of the text in front of you in the exam. So when it asks you to talk about how the themes of power and conflict are present in 2 poems, you have them in front of you and you can just focus on the representation of those themes. That is not the case with the GCSE paper. The students have to learn these off by heart. Another friend of mine, Tosh, who is now an English teacher, says, "Just remember that it is not just poetry that's being made optional, and the only reason it's the first choice to drop for most teachers is because we get an hour, maybe 2 per poem, and the kids basically have to memorize 15 poems, and some of them are 60+ lines long. And some of them are more complex than poems I looked at in my first year of uni, and I could talk about this all day as a teacher and a writer of poetry, so I will stop there, but hit me up for more opinions if you want them." I think this is a really good point. I actually didn't have to learn poems off by heart until I was at my A-levels, and even as someone who is, you know, really okay with English lit and can engage with poetry and text and analysing and stuff like that really well, I really struggled with that exam because I was panicking too much about it being a memory test and not an understanding test. Another way you could change the focus of the paper is presented to me by Chloe, one of my poetry pals, and she says that she would change the way it is taught. I think there should be more emphasis on getting young people to write poetry rather than analysing other works that may have no relevance to them. So a balanced mix of analysing other work, including living, black, female, disabled, etc. poets, and then having a go at using the techniques to write their own. I have to say, I thoroughly agree with this. I do think analysing poetry is a really important way of learning how to write poetry yourself, but also I think learning how to write poetry is a great way of learning how to analyse poetry as well. So hands down agree with Chloe here. She also makes a great point here that not all kids can afford musical instruments or art supplies, but they all have a pen and paper or a phone. There's no creativity left, and now, more than ever, young people need a way to express themselves, and poetry is such a simple and universal one. I really like that idea of poetry being a simple and universal one. You don't need lots of equipment to engage with it. So it's pretty great, guys. We should all write more poetry, and they shouldn't have cut it from the curriculum. Okay, cool. So now I'm just going to wind up with my opinions on the subject. We've gone through the facts, we've gone through some of the main issues about it. Here's what I think about the whole thing. I think it's really easy for us poets, especially those who aren't in the education system, to really pile on to this decision and say that it's a massive mistake. But the fact is, it is a reaction to the pandemic, and students and teachers have really struggled through this. It is only for 1 year, but I think that it can be seen to set a dangerous precedent, and we need to make sure that poetry does make it back to being compulsory next year. I mean the year after. I also think this news exposes problems that in the curriculum that already existed, but were maybe being ignored by the wider poetry world. In my opinion, it is crazy that poetry is one of the only places where you get diverse voices in the English literature paper. Not only do we know that it is important for students to see their stories and cultures and experiences reflected in what they read, like the message from that English teacher, but as someone who grew up in a rural, small town, predominantly white area, reading and poetry and stories is how I learnt about other people's experiences. Literature and poetry is an exercise in empathy. And in that way, studying literature almost becomes a humanities subject, because you are learning about the human experience through writing. So with that in mind, I think that the reading for the GCSE English Literature paper needs a complete overhaul. You need more diverse voices in there, not just in poetry, but in the prose and stuff like that as well. I also think that the poets that you use on the paper should be updated every couple of years to reflect pressing issues that the students can really engage with and understand. I also think that the focus of the exam is all wrong. As someone who studied English literature all the way through my career, I have done all types of exams. I think that having it a closed book exam for 15 to 16-year-olds is horrifying. It makes the focus all about just memorising these poems instead of developing your understanding and analytics of it. I think that having to memorise poems takes the enjoyment out for a lot of people, and I think that these students are therefore less inclined to go on to study it in the future. And I think that that is something that might contribute to people not liking poetry, is having to memorise these poems for exams instead of just learning how to engage with them as subjects in form and content and all of that good stuff. I also think that having fun writing poetry is a great way for students to engage with how to analyse poetry. You learn the different poetic features and forms that poets might use, learn how to use it yourself, and then it makes it easier to recognise when you go to analyse a poem. So with that in mind, I would say say, 1, make it an open book exam, and 2, 15 poems sounds like a lot. Cut Shakespeare. Cut Shakespeare and do more poetry. Or at least cut 19th century novels. But for now, for this year, I totally understand why teachers and schools might choose to drop the poetry. The way that they're expected to teach it is unrealistic, and if you're already 3 months down in teaching time, I get it. It is a shame, but maybe we can use this news as an opportunity to improve the curriculum going forward. Maybe we could use this opportunity as another example to realise that the Tories don't know how to create an English Lit curriculum. So those are my thoughts, but I want to know what you think, especially if you are a student who is studying for your GCSEs right now, or at least studied for your GCSEs more recently than I did. I'm not going to tell you when, but it was a long time ago. What are your thoughts? What was your experiences studying poetry? Finally, I just want to say thank you to all of my subscribers and to all of my followers who give me feedback, and a huge squishy cuddle to my mum for being interviewed. So that's it for this week's video. I hope you found it useful. Let me know if you'd be interested in more videos about English Lit in the education system. I have to say, I've been through the ringer a bit, and if you're interested about learning more about how English Lit is taught at different levels of education, I'm happy to do that for you. I've still got all of my notes up there because I'm a hoarder. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all next week. Bye.